This is another in a series of events that the Knight Chair on Science and the Environment program has been holding here at Berkeley under the aegis of Michael Pollan, who is the chair holder. And it's a great program that we have because at this moment, as the world is reweaving the way in which it connects in so many ways around commerce rather than around religion, politics, culture, or any of the things that at different points in past history have been its animating principle. We find food at the very center of that reweaving. Of course, in this process of globalization that is precipitating this whole new process of global interaction, we find winners and losers, and we find benefits and liabilities. And it is this balance sheet that we're really here tonight to have a look at. Once, I think food, one could say, was indelibly local, and it's becoming ever more indelibly global. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What exists on each side of the ledger? That's a very important question. Now, to sort of frame this whole discussion, since most of the people on the panel here will give a critique of globalization and how it impacts food production, food marketization, and food consumption, I want to just sort of try to help set the framework through a series of questions, many of which I hope we can address in this session. Is the phenomenon of globalization actually new? Opium, the tea trade with China, spice trade with the Indies, sugar from the Caribbean, oil from the Middle East in the last century and this century are certainly hallmarks of a global trade. So what is it exactly that's happened over the last 2 decades as food consumption, production, and marketing have become ever more a global phenomenon? What's the best argument for globalization, especially when it comes to feeding the world better? And what is to be gained by globalization? Is not globalization beneficial for world hunger and the standards of living in that it brings mass-produced, low-cost commodities onto the world market? What is being lost by the process of globalization? And can there be a virtuous globalization? What is the role of governments and subsidies in this process in ameliorating the abuses and making it better? Should food be treated differently than clothing, tools, and other commodities that are now circulating around the globe with a remarkable fluidity? Is there a chance of reforming the giant food conglomerates? Can McDonald's be made into a virtuous company despite its global reach? Has science and technology advanced or hindered the equitable distribution of food? And I think the answer to that is on, again, both sides of the ledger. Is it possible for agribusiness to develop to help the third world? Is the idea of national self-sufficiency too retro to be workable in this world? And how is it that the concept of globalization, like so many other big ideas that promise so much, how is it that it's run into such heavy weather? Why does so much of the world like fast food? From the soft path perspective, if globalization is reformable, what should we do to make it so? And the final question, which I want to return to at the very end of this session, is what is to be done besides sitting at panels like this? Now, to try to address some of these questions, what we're going to do is each panelist is going to take 8 minutes. We're going to be rather strict about this because we want to get on to the discussion and questions from you all. We are going to afford Comrade Petrini 12 minutes because we'll have some translation involved. Then we're going to have some discussion amongst the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to you. So welcome to all of you. I look forward to a great event. Now, the first person to make their 8-minute delivery will be Michael Pollan. So Michael, do you want to hold forth?
Don't use up my 8 minutes. I brought a little corn to go with our apples here. Thank you very much. I have to say it's kind of daunting being on a panel and speaking first with so many of my own teachers, really. These have been my mentors on this panel, taught me really almost everything I know about food. I'm going to try to take all the abstractions Orville addressed down to a very concrete level for a minute. All food chains, even the most globalized and complex, begin with plants growing in a specific patch of soil somewhere. So I'm going to use my time to look at the global food chain from one of its earthly starting points, which is a cornfield in Iowa. The globalization of food we're hearing about, and I think this goes to the answer of what's sort of new about it, right now is largely a supply-driven phenomenon. And much of that drive originates in the American Corn Belt. So I want to, at kind of warp speed, follow a bushel of Iowa corn through the food chain. Specifically, corn from a farmer named George Naylor in Cherdan, Iowa. He's just harvested, and he harvested 200 bushels of corn an acre. That is an astonishing amount of food. We hear this word bushel, and we kind of think we know what it means, but it's 56 pounds of corn. So 200 bushels in an acre is 10,000 pounds of food. 90,000 kernels. And this explains really how, we read these numbers, one American farmer can feed 118 people now. That's why. It's this astounding productivity. A lot of our food system is about figuring out ways to get rid of those 200 bushels of corn an acre. So 60% of it, on average, we feed to livestock. It goes to factory farms. 10% we eat ourselves in the form of high fructose corn syrup and other goodies that are made from corn. 10% we feed to our cars now, and it will soon be more in the form of ethanol. And 20% we export, and that's really what we're going to talk about. According to the grain elevator that buys George Naylor's corn every fall, much of that 20% finds its way to Mexico, about 1,800 kernels of each of his bushels of corn. Since NAFTA, and the reason I want to talk about Mexico is that it's kind of ahead of the curve on globalization. They have already opened their borders. They have already kind of globalized their economy under NAFTA. The U.S. has doubled its exports of corn to Mexico. This is, of course, the country that gave us corn in the first place, where corn evolved. Now we're selling it back to them with all sorts of serious consequences: environmental, social, economic. So why does Mexico, the ancestral home of corn, buy 200 million bushels of American corn today? Well, in a word, because it's cheap. Because farmers like Naylor can sell it for less than $2 a bushel. Remember, 56 pounds of food for about $1.79. And this is almost $1 less than it costs to produce that bushel of corn. So how can that be? How do they sell corn for $1 less than it costs to make it? Well, that's a complicated story, and subsidies are the culprit you always hear about, and it's certainly one reason. The government is cutting a check to George Naylor for every bushel of corn he produces, and that makes up a lot of that distance between the sale price and the cost of production. But I would argue that that mountain of cheap corn that's washing over the world right now preceded subsidies and will survive their elimination if that ever happens. But I'll get back to that right at the end. The key factor in all this, the supply-driven kind of wash of corn across the world, is not subsidies so much as overproduction, simply the astounding productivity of an Iowa cornfield. This is, there's 6 feet of topsoil in these places. There used to be about 12, it's true, but there still is 6 feet of topsoil. It's incredibly productive land. The plant deserves some credit too. I mean, it's gone from 20 bushels an acre 100 years ago to 200 now. It's a very thrifty plant. It can turn a great deal of sunlight and water into a great deal of food. But it's also a plant that's adapted very well to us, to our capitalist system and to our technology. Hybrids, combines, pesticides, fertilizers. It's just kind of gobbled this up and thrived, especially nitrogen fertilizer. No plant can make better use of it. Like us, this plant was happy to make the transition from a solar source of energy to a fossil fuel source of energy, and now it takes a gallon of fossil fuel to grow every bushel of corn. Much of the yield growth that's driven all this corn, created this mountain, has been pushed by government and industry, and it's usually been done under the banner, the blameless sounding banner of feeding the world. Every innovation, that argument has been cited. Yet it turns out that in the real world, too much food is almost as big a problem as too little. The same mountain of cheap grain is contributing to the obesity crisis in this country, because all that corn is really the building block of Eric's fast food nation. It creates the cheap beef, it makes possible the big sodas, the big gulps, and it contributes in other places to hunger, which sound from Africa to Mexico. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive. How could this be? Cheap food making people hungry, but that actually is exactly what's happening. And I just want to try to give you an idea how that could be in my remaining time. So let's follow that corn to Mexico. Since NAFTA, as I said, we're exporting twice as much corn, 200 million bushels. What's been the impact? Well, the Carnegie Endowment just last week issued a very interesting report on this. These are not radicals. I could cite Food First, who was there first, but I'll cite the Carnegie Endowment. Since NAFTA, about 10 years ago, the price of corn in Mexico dropped 50%. This collapse in the price of corn, the result of all we're exporting, has forced 1.3 million farmers off their land. They can't compete against the flood tide of American corn. So where do they go? Well, they join the pools of the unemployed in Mexico's cities, and many of them migrate to the United States, where these former farmers end up picking our food to send money back home. That too is part of the globalization of food. Not all Mexican farmers lose. Bigger farmers growing for export are selling fresh fruits and vegetables in the United States, which is a good and a bad thing. We now can get vegetables any season. It's true some of them come with hepatitis, but that too is part of globalization. A lot of these export farms end up buying the land from these small farmers, consolidating it, and we end up with a situation under free trade where it makes economic sense for a hungry country to use its best land to feed a country where food is so abundant that people are obese. This makes economic sense. It obviously doesn't make human sense. It doesn't make environmental sense. Those export farms intensify their agriculture to compete, and all this cheap corn is leading to the industrialization of their livestock. This is a people who never used to feed corn to animals. They thought it was sacrilegious, and now they have factory farms and all the pollution problems that come with it. And then lastly, there is the problem of genetic pollution. Our genetically engineered corn traits, as a researcher on this campus has found, has now shown up in the ancestral land races of corn. Very important genetic heritage that has now been contaminated. But in fact, the bigger threat to that genetic diversity, and we depend on that to keep this crop healthy, is the loss of these small farmers. Because corn is as dependent on us as we are on it. Without farmers to farm it every year, it goes extinct. And if our cheap corn drives those farmers out of business, as it is, there will not be the genes that we need to keep this crop alive and all the people who depend on it. So I'm going to leave it right there, and I didn't get to talk about subsidies, but I hope we'll get back to that and why I don't think eliminating subsidies, while they're part of the problem, eliminating them is not necessarily part of the solution. Thank you very much.
So next we have Carlo Petrini.
Io devo parlare, ma applico la biodiversità anche nel linguaggio, quindi parlerò italiano.
I apply biodiversity also in language, therefore I'm going to speak in Italian.
In genere ci chiamano solo per cantare, ma questa volta vorrei dire alcune cose interessanti, spero. Vai.
In general, I'm only called to sing, but this time I hope that it will be some interesting things as well. And then he says, come on.
Beh, io devo dire una cosa, che intervenire in un contesto di dibattito ecologico per un gastronomo è stato per tanto tempo impossibile.
I have to say something, that to be part of a discussion, an ecological discussion for a gastronomer has been very difficult, impossible for a long time.
Perché per troppo tempo i gastronomi sono stati un po' orgogliosi di essere stupidi.
Because for too long, gastronomers have been too proud of being stupid.
Ora, io penso invece che la gastronomia debba uscire da questo limbo di stupidità generale.
And I believe that gastronomy should come out of this limbo of general stupidity.
Pieno di gente che spadella davanti alle televisioni, che presenta il cibo, che fa spettacolo sul cibo e che è profondamente ignorante di come arriva il cibo sulla tavola.
People who play around with food in front of a TV set, who makes food into a spectacle, and people who are absolutely ignorant of how food arrives to the table.
Allora ecco che il senso che Slow Food ha voluto dare nel liberare la gastronomia da questo contesto è di unirla fortemente al senso ambientalista, e quindi noi amiamo essere definiti ecogastronomi.
And so in this sense, this is what Slow Food has tried to do, to free gastronomy from this context and to join it with the environmental sense. And this is why we call ourselves eco-gastronomers.
Perché se è pur vero, come dicevo prima, che un gastronomo che non è ambientalista è stupido, è altrettanto vero che un ambientalista che non è gastronomo è triste.
If I was saying before that a gastronomer who's not an environmentalist is stupid or an idiot, I also would like to say that an environmentalist who's not a gastronomer is also very sad.
Ora, io penso che il cibo è importante quasi come il linguaggio.
And I think that food is almost as important as language.
E dà il senso di identità più del linguaggio.
And it provides a sense of identity even more so than language.
Col linguaggio basta avere una traduttrice e risolto il problema.
With language, all you have to have is an interpreter and problem solved.
Con il cibo no.
Not so with food.
Con il cibo non è possibile, perché il cibo è legato al nostro cordone ombelicale.
Not so with food, because food is directly linked to our umbilical cord.
E non c'è neanche stato trasmesso da nostra mamma, ma da nostra nonna in genere.
And in general, this was not even something that came from our mothers, but generally from our grandmothers.
E quanto il cibo è importante per la storia, per l'identità di un popolo, per la salute psicologica della gente, per la sua serenità. È enorme questa importanza.
So therefore, food is very, very important, not only for history and the identity of people, but the psychological health of people, for their serenity. This is how important it is.
In qualche misura le similitudini col linguaggio ci sono, perché se per la lingua esiste l'alfabeto per il cibo è la materia prima.
And there are some similarities with language, because of course we have the alphabet, and the alphabet for food, it's the raw matter, the basic ingredients.
La grammatica sono le ricette.
And grammar are the recipes.
La sintassi sono i menù.
And syntax becomes the menu.
E la retorica è la convivialità.
And the rhetoric is conviviality, sharing.
Ecco allora quanto è importante che il cibo sia determinante anche nelle battaglie che ci sono oggi in questa globalizzazione che tende sul cibo a distruggere un grande patrimonio gastronomico di biodiversità.
And therefore food is extremely important in today's battles, in the battles in globalization, because there is a tendency to fight a whole heritage, and that is destroying also our biodiversity.
Porta all'appiattimento del gusto, alla non più una personalizzazione, un qualcosa che noi sentiamo profondo, mangiamo tutti uguali, dappertutto.
It's the flattening, it's the evening out of taste. No longer this identity, this personal identity of personal flavor, but bringing everywhere everything the same, everything homogenized.
Allora se è vero che noi dobbiamo ricostruire questa identità, noi dobbiamo essere in prima linea in questa battaglia.
So if we have to recover this identity, we have to be in the front of this battle.
Con lo stesso orgoglio, con la stessa forza di un ambientalista.
And we have to have the same pride and the same strength as an environmentalist.
Coscienti che possiamo iniziare un processo di globalizzazione virtuosa.
And we have to become aware that we can start a process of globalization, but a virtuous globalization.
La globalizzazione ha un aspetto deleterio perché è l'ideologia dominante che ha imposto questa globalizzazione negativa.
And globalization has a deleterious and noxious effect because it's the dominating ideology that has exercised this very negative force.
E come dice il mio amico Edgar Morin, grande filosofo francese,
My friend Edgar Morin, a great French philosopher, says,
e anche socio di Slow Food,
and he's also a member of Slow Food.
dice che c'è come un quadrimotore
He says it's like 4 engines.
che non riusciamo a fermare e che ci porta sul baratro, diritti verso il baratro.
But these are 4 engines that we cannot stop, and that they're taking us directly into to death.
E questo quadrimotore è fatto da scienza, tecnologia, industria e profitto.
And these 4 engines are made up of science, technology, industry, and profit.
Scienza riduzionista, che ha la verità, ha in sé la verità. La tecnologia che risolve tutti i problemi. L'industria che produce di più. E il profitto alla fine è l'unica cosa vera.
And so science that believes that it has the truth, technology that produces everything, and then profit, of course, that think is the only true thing.
Allora la globalizzazione virtuosa è possibile. Ed è possibile da chi si oppone al quadrimotore.
And virtuous globalization is possible, and it is possible when someone opposes these 4 engines.
E ce ne sono tanti che si combattono il quadrimotore.
And there are so many people who are fighting these 4 engines.
Non solo quelli che vanno giustamente alle manifestazioni, no global, ma anche quelli che si impegnano quotidianamente per rispondere e difendere la biodiversità.
And they're not just the people who go to demonstrations, but people who on a daily basis commit themselves to the defense of biodiversity.
Penso alla vita umile e dimenticata di milioni di contadini del terzo mondo e anche di questo mondo.
And I'm thinking about the humble lives of forgotten peasants in the third world and also of this
Sono
world.
loro che combattono il quadrimotore.
They are the ones who are struggling against
Noi
these 4
dobbiamo
engines.
semplicemente aiutarli, scusa.
And vai.
Il tempo è tremendo.
Yes, and therefore, and the only thing that we have to do is help them do this.
Io pensavo di tutto, ma a meno che il presidente di Slow Food fosse invitato a parlare fast.
I've thought about everything. I can imagine everything, but I never thought that the president of Slow Food was asked to talk fast.
Sono rispettoso, è un minuto, solo un minuto.
Oh, yes, I'm respecting your timeline. Yes, only 1 minute.
Allora la biodiversità, se non ha questa costruzione di soggetti che sono per il mondo,
If biodiversity does not have this structure of people that are in favor of the world, are working towards the world,
è questa alleanza che noi dobbiamo fare.
this is the alliance that we have to create.
Non è possibile fermare il quadrimotore.
Otherwise, we will not be able to stop these 4 engines.
Allora noi dobbiamo lavorare quotidianamente per sostenere la biodiversità, per sviluppare il consenso, per fare in modo che ci sia più conoscenza e più educazione, molta educazione.
So we have to work on a daily basis to preserve biodiversity, to develop consensus, and to develop more than anything else education, education, and education.
E lasciatemi dire che l'educazione c'è anche una componente sensoriale.
And I have to tell you that education has a sensory component as well,
Non c'è solo la componente intellettuale.
not just the intellectual aspect.
Noi abbiamo una parte del cervello che è la memoria gusto-olfattiva.
We have a part of the brain that has the taste and smell memory.
E costruiamo alcuni ragionamenti in base agli odori.
And we create thinking, arguments, and thoughts on the basis of smells.
E allora bisogna aiutare i bambini a crescere con questa educazione dei profumi,
So we have to help children grow up with this education of smells,
anche delle puzze.
even bad smells.
Perché questa gente che fa 4 docce al giorno
Because there are people who take 4 showers a day.
non ha più le puzze per poter fare l'amore.
So they no longer have the right smells to make love.
E avendo io chiedo scusa, ecco, però
I apologize, I'm sorry.
Però io vorrei che questa sera, se andate via, vi sia rimasto questo piccolo senso dell'importanza della gastronomia.
Well, what I would like is for you, when you go home tonight, that you have in your minds this small sense of what is gastronomy
E dell'atto del mangiare.
and the action of eating.
E io la frase più bella che ho sentito nella mia vita l'ho sentita da quel signore che è là che fa il contadino.
And the most beautiful sentence, the most beautiful phrase I've ever heard in my life, I heard it from that gentleman over there who's a farmer.
Lui ha detto che mangiare è un atto agricolo.
He said that eating is an agricultural event,
È fantastico.
and that's extraordinary.
Noi possiamo incidere sull'agricoltura mangiando bene
We can have an influence and impact on agriculture if we eat well,
e avendo un buon rapporto con i contadini.
and having a good relationship with peasants.
Ma anche i contadini devono imparare a essere gastronomi.
But peasants as well need to learn to be gastronomers.
Allora io dico che coltivare deve essere innanzitutto un atto gastronomico.
So my statement is that cultivating is above all a gastronomic event.
E quindi avere a cuore anche il rapporto di chi dovrà mangiare questi suoi prodotti.
And to really keep in mind, to have in their heart the knowledge of who's going to eat their
E
products
come lo dovrà
and
mangiare.
the way they have to be consumed
E quanto lo dovrà pagare.
and how much they should be paid for.
Ma questo ve lo racconterò un'altra volta.
But that is something else, is for another time.
Grazie.
Thank you.
All right, next, Wendell Berry. Wendell?
After long practice, I can say all I know in 8 minutes. Eventually, it'll be a haiku. My starting point is the failure of the environmental movement to envision and promote a conserving land-based economy. The movement has failed to foresee or envision a mean between the pristine and the utterly spoiled. There's talk now among biologists of dividing the world 50-50 between nature preserves and industrial farming and forestry. But this abandons any hope of harmony between human life and the life of the world, without which neither can be preserved. We have failed to address the issue of local adaptation, which is a law from which no species is exempt, including our own. And we're now farther from obedience to that law than we've ever been before. The present land economy of farming, forestry, and so on rests on a foundation of general ignorance. Most of us don't know how we live or at what cost, either ecologically or humanly. We speak sentimentally of a sense of place and of having roots. But a sense of place, if it is of any real worth, consists of a set of correct, practical solutions to local problems. Why are locally adapted economies necessary? We have talked enough, maybe, about the pleasures of fresh, tasty, locally produced food. We have not talked nearly enough about the vulnerability of economic systems that are both global and centralized. Their vulnerability, that is, to epidemics, terrorism, and other forms of human and natural violence. Nor have we acknowledged clearly enough that these very extensive systems are entirely dependent on cheap transportation, which is entirely dependent on cheap petroleum. It now seems that petroleum, for which there is no substitute, is going to become more expensive in money and perhaps in blood. And so we have got to begin again to think about limits, ecological and moral. For how long can we maintain the industrialist superstition that we can feed the world by destroying the world's capacity to produce food? And are we, in the developed nations, really prepared to feed ourselves by buying food off the plates of people in poorer countries? What are we Americans to think of ourselves, who find it easy to condemn the Negro slavery of the Old South, and equally easy to live off the labor of racially denominated wage slaves in fields and factories here and elsewhere? The world is limited in land, water, fertility, and energy. In such a world, people with moral limits must develop their local economies, must shorten their supply lines, and take responsibility for their economic influence. Unless we believe that cheap long-distance transportation is somehow infinite, we cannot justify the destruction of any local capacity to produce necessary goods. A due regard to local economy does not preclude a regional, national, or global economy. Nor does the existence of the larger economies necessarily interfere with the proper development of local economies, so long as the principles of subsistence and surplus are respected throughout. Only the surplus should be exploited, after local needs have been met. The surplus can then be passed along as charity or as commodities fairly priced. The principles of subsistence, charity, and fair pricing belong to an economy of neighborliness and are directly opposed to the principles of the industrial economy and the so-called free market.
Well, that was commendable brevity. Now, Vandana, Shiva, you're next.
Let me begin with a confession. I'm here just to pay tribute to this amazing panel. And we were asked to address the question about globalization, about it being new. Wasn't there trade in sugar and cotton? Sugar and cotton aren't staple foods. Cotton is not food at all in any case. But long before the first globalization based global trade on slavery, we had genuinely free international trade. My country was among the leaders in it. India was exporting spices long before the Europeans thought they should colonize the world to control the spice trade. And of course, they landed here thinking they were coming to India. But it was only trade in spice. And I worked on those farms, those spice gardens in southern India and the Western Ghats. Each farm will only cultivate 1/10 of its land with spice gardens. The rest will be rice. And the rice is not even exported to the rest of the country. The spice gardens are supported with 10 times the area of forest, so the spice gardens became major conservation zones. And during colonialism, we had huge conflicts because the British wanted to convert those forests, they're called better lands, into timber mines. And the farmers said, no, these are the base of sustenance of these farms. These spice gardens have existed as long as history can be recorded. They have become unviable now because globalization is leading to a collapse of prices in spice gardens of the same 50% that Mexican farmers are experiencing due to dumping of grain. And I think that really is at the heart of the new globalization. The last globalization also had a free trade treaty. I'm sure most of you never heard of it. It was called the Farrukhshire Farman with the Right Honorable East India Company, 1716. Exactly the same rules as NAFTA, same rules as WTO, same rules that basically say punish the local economy and reward the global predator. Change the entire system so that those who pirate and trade do well, and those who do honest business disappear. We got rid of that one through our freedom movement. We also with it drove away hunger, because hunger was a very important legacy of a system of farming that forced Indian peasants to grow indigo and did not allow them to grow food. Indian peasants had to grow during the American Revolution when cotton couldn't be supplied from here. Our farmers had to grow cotton for exports, couldn't grow food. No one did that willingly. No farmer wanted to only grow export crops. The famine that we had, 2 million people killed in 1940, led to a major rebellion, revolt, rethinking. We got freedom, we got rid of hunger. We redistributed land, and I think miraculously became the only society in the contemporary world that made the rural areas viable for 75% of our population. There is no other part of the world where 750 million people make a living in agriculture. And yet that 750 million people's livelihoods and lives are threatened because of a new trade system, which I believe is based on two totally illegitimate principles. The first is the principle of the right to dump, which is sell below the cost of production. And I agree with Michael, it's not just about subsidies. Because anyway, subsidies given to farmers to grow for the domestic market don't hurt farmers in another region. It's subsidies linked to reducing prices and then selling the product overseas, under a condition where you don't have a right to prevent that kind of import because of the removal of import restrictions and all the laws on market access in the WTO agreement. So it ends up being a right to dump. Right to dump now at 50% across commodities below the cost of production. That's what free trade rules are about. And the second, I would call the right to force feed. Is the right that is being exercised through WTO rules to force Indians to stop eating food cooked with their edible oils and only eat food cooked with palmolene. I believe it was not meant to be an edible oil, or GM soya oil. And I can't go into details in these 10 minutes of how that was achieved. Or the more recent dispute introduced against the European Union in the WTO by the United States government to say the Europeans don't have a right to say no to genetically engineered food, or now, after August, don't even have a right to regulate the GM imports with labeling, segregation, and traceability laws. These are force-feeding laws. So the combination of false prices and forced feeding, in my view, doesn't lead to free trade. It leads to forced trade. And that is the real problem with the free trade agreements. They are about forcing trade on unwilling producers and unwilling consumers, and using trade instruments as a coercive measure, which is why there was rebellion in Cancun, which is why recently the FTA had to remove agriculture from negotiations. I would count that as a failure of FTA, it's just that they didn't allow it to be announced as that, because agriculture is a very major element of why these larger free trade areas is needed. These rules are emerging very clearly as true rules of vicious globalization. And Carlo has used the term virtuous globalization. I believe you can only have virtuous globalization if it isn't about globalization first. That virtuous globalization can only be based on localization first. First, because food, unlike anything else, needs the soil, the biodiversity, the water, and unless we conserve those, we are never ever going to have virtuous production. Secondly, if we cannot maintain farmers on the land and guarantee livelihoods through robust local economies, we are not going to have virtuous trade. Thirdly, if we have to enrich each other's lives through adding of diversity and quality, we have to ensure that that quality and diversity is maintained where it belongs in local cultures and local ecosystems. And that is why global trade can only be supportive of ecologically sustainable agriculture, local production, with leftovers reaching global markets. Leftovers reaching global markets on fair trade principles, just prices, and mutual giving and taking between consumers and producers. Recognizing that producers who might be impoverished by artificially coercive systems of false pricing are not lesser human beings. And just because you sit in a stock market can bet on the global casino doesn't make you a superior human being, just allows you to have more disposable income, and you have a duty to put more of it back to maintain the earth and to maintain farmers. I think it's that mutuality that is going to create the new partnerships that will bring the agriculture and farm movement and food movement at the heart of the ecology movement. And we know the ecology movement is in need for life support. And here's the opportunity. The food movement can give the ecology movement life support, but it is not just the ecology movement that needs life support, because the real subsidies that are distorting the trading system are subsidies that aren't going to farmers, they're going to cheap oil, they're the subsidies that allow wars to happen, they're the subsidies that allow the entire plant material of the planet to belong to one or two companies. Intellectual property rights is a huge hidden subsidy. Paying farmers less than what it has cost them to produce, whether it is through direct income support, no matter what the trick used to buy below cost of production, that is a subsidy. And those don't come directly from governments, those come from corporations, ripping off the farmer, and society then bearing the cost somehow in ill health, dispossessed farmers, and disappearing rural communities. I think we need rural communities everywhere in the world. Support to local agriculture anywhere in the world needs to be strengthened. What we need to see disappear is the distortions in pricing. If we can just hang on there on the demand for just prices and just trade, and keep working in all kinds of creative ways, some people in changing the trade rules, others just building local organic markets, others just celebrating food as the ultimate cultural creation of humanity, I think we will very soon be able to fill the vacuum left after the failure of Cancun in a creative way. I think we are being called on to create the new world order, and it will look very different from the present one. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Now, Eric Schlosser.
Well, I want to talk about some of the things that Vandana and Orville first mentioned about globalization and world trade. And it's true that white men came to this country looking for spices. And it's also true that there would not be a United States if there wasn't a trade dispute over dumping. And it was the same British East India Company that was dumping tea at a very low price onto the American market, and it really angered the tea distributors on the East Coast. And that was really the beginning of the United States. So globalization, and particularly the global trade in agricultural goods, is as old as mankind. But the question is, what are the terms of that trade? And who is benefiting from it? Now, when there was a British Empire, the British Empire benefited profoundly from it. And when they followed a mercantilist policy, they used their colonies as sources of raw material that they would exploit. But once it was in their interest, and once they had a very strong manufacturing base, they turned to, quote, free trade, unquote, because it was in their interest. Again and again, you see the terms of world trade being dictated by the dominant world power. And this may be a very blasphemous thing to say in the United States in the year 2003. But there is no such thing as free trade, and there never has been. There has always been trade dictated by the powerful countries to the weaker countries. And slavery in this country, and the origins of slavery in this country, were very much tied to a particular form of agricultural export. And in the same way, the enslavement of people in other countries is right now being driven by a particular form of trade and agricultural export. And as Wendell mentioned, even within this country right now, there are all kinds of economic relationships that are very similar to peonage. So you have to get rid of this notion of free trade. The only free trade there is right now, I would argue, is that you are free to give large sums of money to the Republican Party, and in return, you will be able to trade. So when you're talking about this global trade in agriculture, or you're talking about the world economic system and how it's been transformed in the last 20 years, what you're talking about is a centralization of corporate power and a growth in corporate power. And I don't come to this in a narrowly anti-corporate way, but I am opposed to the unbridled corporate power that we now see in the world. And it is of enormous importance when it comes to food. It may just be irritating when it comes to music, but when it comes to food, it has profound importance, because there is no other industry without food. Food is the bedrock of our civilization, and as Wendell has written about for years, it is the determinant of the physical landscape and the cultural landscape. And I think that we have to look at the product that is being pushed onto the world as a form of pollution. It is a form of pollution that is polluting not just the landscape through these gigantic factory farms, through genetically modified organisms that we have no idea what the consequences are going to be for generations, but it's also a pollution of our culture and of our society. This centralized, uniform corporate culture that I would argue is the antithesis of freedom. It's the antithesis of anything that Adam Smith ever envisaged, and it's much closer to corporate socialism. And when you look at where those subsidies are going, and not just the farm subsidies going to agribusiness, but the enormous subsidies that are given to the oil companies, we will fight wars for them, we will send our young to die for them. This is a cost too high to pay. So I would argue that this cheap food is much, much too expensive for our culture. Now, I wrote about McDonald's. McDonald's a few years ago had a slogan that I found telling and chilling, and their slogan was "One Taste Worldwide." Now, all you need to do is draw a little mustache on a Ronald, and you get a sense of what that ideology ultimately means. And we have dealt for the last 100 years with one ideology after another that's trying to impose uniformity and conformity. And what everyone on this panel is arguing for is the antithesis, which is a respect for diversity, a respect for regional identity. And this corporate concentrated system is working towards the opposite. Now, because I'm the last one, I actually want to try to end on a cheery note. And the cheery note is that these forces are so big and so powerful that it's very, very easy to just feel despair and feel like there's no point in trying to do anything. And there is this feeling of inevitability that they promote through their literature, and they promote in their writings about science that this is somehow inevitable. This is somehow the working out of progress. And I would put forward that that's total bull. And when you look more closely at the subsidies, at the bribery, at the corruption, there was nothing inevitable about this system. And if there's nothing inevitable about it, the corollary is things don't have to be the way they are. Now, the British East India Company may exist as a nameplate on a door somewhere, but it used to be pretty powerful, and it's gone. The British Empire no longer rules India. Slavery is gone for the most part, except in some agricultural sectors in this country. And apartheid is gone in South Africa, and on we can talk about big, bad institutions that have been removed. So all of these changes are possible, and this all sounds very highfalutin, but I'm going to end with a very concrete suggestion about how this change can begin. And it's just 2 words, and it's something that I care passionately about. And that would be boycott, Tyson. Tyson Foods is the largest meatpacking company the world has ever seen. IBP, which they own, has pioneered the cutting of wages and the breaking of unions, and there is a strike right now in Jefferson, Wisconsin. They took over a small meatpacking plant that had been in the town for 125 years. The workers went on strike. They've been locked out. Scabs have been brought in. The workers were trying to prevent themselves from having wages frozen and starting wages cut by 30%. So if you'd like to make a difference, there are all kinds of meaningful and profound and complex ways to do it. But just by refusing to buy anything made by Tyson, I would argue that's a very good start. So thank you very much.